She was 19 years old when the bank took everything her family had ever owned and stood that same week in a black wool coat too heavy for the dry Kansas heat, watching strangers carry her mother's kitchen table out into the yard to be sold for pennies on a debt she did not believe was honestly owed. Augustus Pruitt, president of the First Prairie Bank of Cedar Hollow, had signed the foreclosure papers himself, calling it nothing more than a regrettable matter of arithmetic, though the arithmetic, as far as Selah Hartwell could tell, had only ever seemed to favor the bank. When the dust of that auction finally settled, she had $18 to her name, a tin trunk, and nowhere left in the county that felt like home. So when she heard, a month later, that the bank itself was quietly selling off the old, condemned grain elevator at the edge of town, the one boarded shut for 15 years, the one half the town called cursed, for a price scarcely worth the bank's trouble of collecting, she walked in and bought it for $30 she could not truly spare. Everyone told her she had bought a ruin. What none of them knew was that somewhere up in its dark, dust-choked rafters, an honest man's secret had been waiting 15 years to be found, a secret that would not only save her, but finally call the bank itself to account. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Selah Hartwell. If you've ever stood in the wreckage of something everyone else had already given up on, tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear how you found your way through it. Selah Hartwell had been born in the spring of 1875 on a modest grain farm 3 miles outside Cedar Hollow, Kansas, the only daughter of Amos and Ruth Hartwell, and from the time she was old enough to walk the rows behind her father's wagon, she had been taught to understand wheat the way some children are taught to understand scripture, as something sacred, something that demanded both labor and honesty in equal measure. Amos Hartwell was not a large man, nor a loud one, but he carried a quiet, stubborn integrity that the whole township recognized, even those who found it inconvenient. He had farmed that same parcel of land since before Selah's birth, hauling his wheat each harvest to the grain elevator at the edge of town, where it was weighed, graded, and stored until it could be shipped east by rail. And he taught his daughter early that the scale at that elevator was the one place in the whole transaction where a farmer's entire year of sweat either was or was not honestly accounted for. "A bushel is a bushel, Selah," he used to say, turning a handful of wheat slowly between his fingers as though testing its truthfulness. "And any man who tips the scale against you is stealing just as surely as if he'd put his hand in your pocket." Ruth Hartwell died of a fever when Selah was 9, leaving father and daughter to manage the farm and the grief together, and in the years that followed, Selah became, in practice if not in title, her father's full partner, learning to judge a kernel's moisture by the sound it made cracking between her teeth, to read a grain elevator's weight ticket with a sharper eye than most clerks twice her age, to keep careful books in a hand as neat as any banker's. It was old Elias Foss, the longtime manager of the Cedar Hollow grain elevator, who first noticed the girl's gift for numbers and her father's stubborn honesty both, and who took a quiet, grandfatherly liking to her on the long afternoons she came along to watch her father's wheat weighed and stored. Foss had managed that elevator since it was first raised in the early 1870s, back when it had been built jointly by a cooperative of local farmers and the newly founded First Prairie Bank under its first president, Silas Pruitt, and Foss took a plain, old-fashioned pride in running an honest scale, in a trade where Selah's father always said an honest scale was rarer than most people liked to admit. She remembered him showing her once how the great balance beam worked, how a single grain of sand in the wrong place could be enough to cheat a man without his ever knowing it, and she remembered, too, the strange gravity in his voice when he told her, "The day this scale stops telling the truth, child, is the day this whole town starts starving without knowing why." She was perhaps 11 years old when he said it, and she did not understand it then so much as she simply kept it, the way a person keeps a stone in their pocket without quite knowing why it matters, until years later, in circumstances neither of them could have foreseen, it would matter very much indeed. Selah grew into her teens much as her father had raised her, capable with her hands, careful with numbers, slow to judge and quick to notice what others overlooked, whether that was a struggling neighbor's unspoken hunger or a clerical error buried 3 columns deep in a ledger. It was a quiet, dignified life, built on the conviction, instilled in her as plainly as her own name, that honest work, honestly accounted for, was the whole foundation a person's worth and a community's ought to be built on. She had no way of knowing, in those steady years on her father's land, how violently that foundation was about to be tested, nor how directly the old grain elevator at the edge of town, and the secret it had quietly kept for 15 years, would one day become the very instrument of her survival. The trouble began, as trouble in farming country so often did, with weather no one could control and debts no one had expected to call due all at once. The drought of 1893 settled over that stretch of Kansas like a held breath that simply refused to release, withering Amos Hartwell's wheat in the field 2 years running. And when the panic struck that same autumn, rattling banks and credit alike clear across the country, the first prairie bank of Cedar Hollow, now under the management of Silas Pruitt's son, Augustus, since his father's death some years before, began calling in loans with a suddenness that left half the farmers in the county scrambling. Amos Hartwell had borrowed modestly against the farm 2 seasons earlier, the way most of his neighbors had, to cover seed and a new well after the old one ran dry, and he had never missed a payment in his life until the drought made payment, for one single season, briefly impossible. He went to Augustus Pruitt himself, hat in hand, asking only for the kind of patient extension that any reasonable banker might grant a man with 20 years of honest dealing behind him, and Pruitt, smiling the same thin, practiced smile his father had once worn, told him that the bank's hands were unfortunately tied by obligations of its own. Selah, 18 by then, and keeping her father's books as carefully as ever, went over every figure herself and found something that troubled her far more than the drought ever had: a series of small, recurring discrepancies in the interest calculated against her father's loan, discrepancies that, added together across 2 years, amounted to nearly as much as the very shortfall the bank now claimed had pushed them into default. She brought this, respectfully and in writing, to the bank's clerk, a nervous young man named Otis Greer, who would not quite meet her eyes, and was told only that the figures had been reviewed and found correct, and that further inquiry would not be entertained. Within the month, the foreclosure notice arrived, and within 2 months more, the farm Amos Hartwell had worked for 2 decades was sold at auction to settle a debt that Selah remained quietly, stubbornly certain had never been honestly owed in the first place. Her father did not live to see the worst of it. The strain of that final winter, the cold nights in a rented room above the feed store after the farm was lost, the slow, grinding humiliation of watching his life's work scattered across an auction block for whatever strangers cared to bid, settled into his chest as a sickness that the town doctor called pneumonia, but that Selah, in her grief, privately understood as something closer to a broken heart, given a medical name. He died in the early spring of 1894, and Selah buried him beside her mother in the Cedar Hollow churchyard with $18 in her pocket, the last remainder of what little had been salvaged from the auction, and absolutely no family left in the world to soften the cold, practical question of what she was meant to do now. She took a room at a boarding house run by a widow named Pearl Anders, paying out coins she knew would not last, and spent her days walking the dusty streets of a town that had known her whole life, and yet now seemed to look through her, as though a girl with no farm and no father had somehow also lost the right to be properly seen. It was Pearl Anders herself, in fact, who first mentioned, almost in passing over a thin supper of beans and cornbread, that the bank had finally decided to quietly dispose of the old condemned grain elevator at the edge of town, the one that had stood boarded and silent since old Elias Foss's strange and sudden death some 15 years before. The one half of Cedar Hollow still crossed themselves over, walking past after dark, as though the building itself had done something to deserve its abandonment rather than simply having been left to rot. Selah remembered Elias Foss with a fondness that surprised her, given how distant those memories now felt, and remembered, too, vaguely, the unease that had followed his death. A fall from the elevator's upper gallery, the town had said, though even as a child, she recalled hearing her father mutter that it seemed an odd way for a man as careful as Foss to die. The bank, she learned, had owned the structure outright since shortly after Foss's death, having bought out the original Farmers' Cooperative shares for almost nothing in the confusion that followed, and had simply let it stand empty ever since, declaring it structurally unsound and not worth the expense of either repair or demolition. Now, needing whatever scraps of cash it could gather amid the same general financial panic that had ruined her own father, the bank was finally selling it off, as is and without warranty, for the price of its back taxes and nothing more. Something in Selah, some stubborn echo of her father's old conviction that nothing knocked about by hard luck was necessarily without its use, made her walk into the very bank that had ruined her family and ask, in a voice she fought hard to keep steady, what exactly the asking price might be. Augustus Pruitt, seated behind the same broad desk where he had once told her father his hands were tied, looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not quite name, amusement perhaps, or something closer to contempt, before naming a sum of $30, payable in full, the building and grounds to be hers entirely and without further claim from the bank. It was, by any sensible measure, the worst possible use of nearly every dollar she had left in the world, and yet she paid it, signing the deed with a hand that did not shake nearly as much as she expected, walking out of that bank as the legal owner of a condemned 15-year abandoned grain elevator that not one other soul in Cedar Hollow had wanted badly enough to bid against her. She went to see it that same afternoon, walking the half-mile from town with the deed folded carefully in her coat pocket, and found the elevator standing exactly as gloomy as its reputation promised, a tall, weathered wooden tower rising up out of the prairie grass, its plank siding gone silver-grey with age, its loading door hanging askew on one rusted hinge, the whole structure leaning, ever so slightly, in a way that made more cautious people cross the road rather than walk beneath it. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old dust and dry rot, and her boots stirred up 15 years of undisturbed grime as she made her way through the ground-floor scale room, where the great balance beam Elias Foss had once shown her still hung in its frame, rusted but intact, like the skeleton of some patient old animal. She climbed the narrow internal ladder up through the storage bins, empty now save for a few inches of ancient chaff gone hard and dark with age, and finally up into the high, open framework of the rafters themselves, where the roof's old shingles let thin blades of afternoon light slant down through gaps no one had ever bothered to repair. It was there, picking her way carefully along a crossbeam toward a section of roof that seemed in slightly better repair than the rest, that her eye caught on something tucked into a notch where two timbers joined, a long, flat object wrapped tightly in oiled canvas and bound with cord that had gone stiff, but, remarkably, had not entirely rotted away, protected as it was from rain by the angle of the roof above it. Her hands trembled as she worked the cord loose, less from cold than from a strange, prickling certainty that whatever had been hidden there had been hidden deliberately by someone who had known precisely how to keep it dry and safe through 15 long years of neglect. Inside the canvas, she found a thick, cloth-bound ledger, its pages dense with a small, careful, familiar hand that she recognized within seconds as belonging to Elias Foss himself, and tucked into its back cover a sealed letter addressed simply to whoever finds this when it is safe to be found. Selah carried both down to the ground floor and sat with them on an overturned grain barrel as the afternoon light failed, working the wax seal loose with fingers gone clumsy from cold and disbelief both, and what she read, first in the letter and then, more slowly and carefully, across the dense pages of the ledger itself, unfolded a story far larger and far darker than she had ever imagined, hiding inside a building the whole town had long since written off as merely unlucky. Elias Foss, it turned out, had discovered, sometime around 1878, that the elevator's weighing scale, The very scale he himself had operated faithfully for years, the very scale her own father had trusted without question, had been quietly and deliberately altered, weighted to register every farmer's grain at a fraction less than its true measure, the shortfall recorded instead under a private account that fed directly back to the bank's own coffers. It had been done, the ledger made plain, on the personal instruction of Silas Pruitt, the bank's founding president and Augustus Pruitt's own father, who had structured the original farmers' cooperative in such a way that the bank retained quiet majority control over the elevator's operation, even as individual farmers believed themselves equal partners in it. For nearly a year, Foss had wrestled with what he had found, fearing that any public accusation against a man as powerful as Silas Pruitt would be dismissed outright, or worse, would cost him his position and leave the scales manipulation entirely unchecked and unrecorded. So he had done what careful, frightened, fundamentally honest men sometimes do in such situations. He had begun, secretly and at considerable personal risk, to keep a second and entirely truthful set of weight records alongside the bank's falsified ones, documenting in his own hand exactly how much had been skimmed from exactly which farmer's harvest, year upon year, family upon family, the columns growing longer and more damning with every passing season. More than this, the ledger revealed, Foss had begun quietly setting aside, from his own modest wages and from a small private fund he managed to build through careful, frugal living, an amount roughly equal to what he calculated the bank had stolen from the town's farmers each year, intending it as restitution, a kind of silent insurance policy he meant to distribute the moment he found a way to expose the fraud without simply being destroyed by it himself. The ledger's final entries, dated in the weeks before his death, grew noticeably more anxious in tone, recording his suspicion that Silas Pruitt had somehow learned he was keeping a private accounting, and his fear that matters were coming to a head far sooner than he had prepared for. The letter, written in that same unsteady hand, confirmed what the ledger could only imply. "If you are reading this," Foss had written, "then I am most likely no longer able to finish the work myself, and I trust that whatever has become of me, it was no accident, however the town may choose to remember it. I have hidden here, alongside this ledger, what restitution I have managed to set aside these past years, not as treasure for whoever finds it, but as a debt this town is rightfully owed, and I pray God sends someone with the patience and the courage to see it properly repaid." Beneath a loose section of the rafter flooring nearby, exactly where the letter described, Selah found a second, heavier bundle, and unwrapping it with hands that had gone entirely steady now, found coin, silver and gold both, carefully counted and recorded against the ledger's own columns, a sum that made the $30 she had spent to buy this ruin seem, suddenly, like the smallest and shrewdest investment any desperate person had ever made. Word that the cast-out Hartwell girl had bought the old condemned elevator and was, of all things, clearing it out and asking strange questions about its long-dead former manager reached Augustus Pruitt within days, carried, as such things in small towns invariably are, by someone who had seen her hauling lumber and lime out to make the place habitable and had thought it curious enough to mention over supper. Pruitt came out to see her himself within the week, dressed in the same fine dark coat he wore to church, his manner pleasant in a way that did not quite reach his eyes, and told her that the bank had recently reconsidered the sale, citing some irregularity in the original tax assessment, and was prepared to buy the property back from her, generously, at 3 times what she had paid, sparing her, he said, the burden of restoring so unsound a structure. It was the very generosity of the offer, more than anything else, that told Selah precisely how much her $3 worth of curiosity had already cost him in worry, because a man who genuinely believed a building worthless did not drive out himself to overpay for it within a week of its sale. She told him, with as much steadiness as her racing pulse allowed, that she would think the matter over, and watched him leave with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes any more than his first one had. That same evening, she walked into town and laid the ledger, the letter, and her whole strange discovery before the one person in Cedar Hollow she trusted absolutely, Otis Greer, the same nervous young bank clerk who had once refused to look her in the eye over her father's disputed interest figures, and who, when she finally confronted him directly with what Foss's ledger revealed, broke down and admitted, in a low and shaking voice, that he had been quietly troubled by inconsistencies in the bank's old scale records for years, inconsistencies he had never dared question aloud for fear of losing the only steady position he had. Together, over the following days, working with great care and greater discretion, they began approaching a handful of the older farming families whose names appeared most heavily in Foss's careful private columns, among them old Vernon Costello, whose family had nearly lost their own land in the very years Foss's ledger showed the heaviest shortfalls, and who remembered, when gently asked, a season when an unexplained sum of cash had reached his struggling household with no clear source, money his own father had simply called an unlooked-for mercy and never thought to question further. Pruitt, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, though not yet certain how much Selah actually knew, moved quickly from generous offers to open hostility, filing a complaint with the county to have the elevator's deed voided on the grounds of improper original tax assessment, and spreading word through the grain exchange that the Hartwell girl, like her ruined father before her, had a strange and troublesome habit of making accusations she could never properly prove. The hearing was set for the second week of June, before the circuit judge in the very Cedar Hollow courthouse, where half the town had once watched Selah's family farm sold away to settle a debt she still believed had never been honest, and it was there, in a room crowded with curious neighbors who had come expecting nothing more than a foolish orphan finally being put properly in her place, that Selah Hartwell rose when her turn came and laid Elias Foss's ledger open upon the clerk's table for the judge and the whole assembled town to see. She did not speak first of buried coin, though by then its existence had become impossible to entirely conceal. She spoke instead, plainly, and in the same careful, unhurried voice her father had once used to explain why a bushel must always be a bushel, of a faithful scale deliberately broken, of a private record kept at terrible personal risk by a man too honest to simply look away, of names and harvests and shortfalls that matched, column for column, families still living and farming in that very county, who had never known how thoroughly they had once been cheated, nor by whom. Otis Greer, called nervously to the stand, confirmed under careful questioning that the bank's original scale mechanism, recovered intact from the elevator's old scale room, showed clear evidence of deliberate tampering consistent with exactly what Foss's ledger described, tampering that had never once been corrected after Foss's death, simply because no honest manager had ever again been trusted to run that scale. Vernon Costello testified, with a quiet dignity that visibly moved the room, to the unexplained mercy his own family had once received and never understood. And when the judge ordered the bank's own original ledgers from the period brought forward for direct comparison against Foss's careful private columns, the figures matched so precisely, year after year, family after family, that Augustus Pruitt, watching the room's quiet certainty turn slowly and irreversibly against him, abandoned his bluster altogether and simply sat, his fine dark coat looking, to every eye present, exactly as ill-fitting as it had likely always been. The judge ruled the elevator's sale entirely valid, the hidden restitution legally Selah's by right of discovery and by the plain written intent of the man who had risked everything to set it aside, and referred the matter of the original scale fraud, along with the unresolved circumstances of Elias Foss's death, to the territorial prosecutor for further and more thorough investigation, a process that would, over the following year, cost Augustus Pruitt his presidency, his standing, and a portion of his own personal fortune in restitution, though Selah, true to the quiet creed her father had given her, never once asked the court for any harsher reckoning than the plain truth, finally and fully exposed. What Selah Hartwell did with the restitution that fell, against every reasonable expectation, into her open hands, told the people of Cedar Hollow more about her than any verdict ever could. She did not simply reclaim her father's lost farm and disappear quietly back into the private life that hardship had once stolen from her, though she did, in time, buy that land back at a fair price from the family who had purchased it at auction. She finished, first and most carefully, the very work Elias Foss's ledger had left unfinished, tracing down, family by family, every farmer his ledger named whose shortfall had never been repaid, and distributing what remained of the hidden restitution according to his own painstaking calculations, so that the debt he had died trying to settle was at last settled fully and exactly as he had intended. She restored the grain elevator itself, not as a private possession, but as what it had originally been meant to be, reconstituting the farmers' cooperative under terms that placed the scale's oversight permanently and transparently in the hands of the farmers themselves, rather than any single bank. And she took on, by the unanimous and rather moved vote of that newly reconstituted cooperative, the position of the elevator's manager, the first woman ever to hold that post in the county, keeping, in her own daily practice, the same scrupulous honesty toward every bushel that her father and Elias Foss had both taught her to believe was the whole foundation a community could be built on. She used a portion of the remaining sum to rebuild her father's farmhouse, not in bitterness, but simply to have, again, a home that was honestly and entirely her own. And in the years that followed, she made a quiet practice of taking on young women from struggling families as apprentices in the elevator's careful bookkeeping, teaching them, as she herself had been taught, to read a column of figures the way her father had once read a kernel of wheat, patiently, honestly, and without ever assuming that a thing's true worth was the same as the price someone else had already decided to give up on it. As for Augustus Pruitt, who had once smiled thinly across his desk and told a grieving girl that his bank's hands were simply tied, he watched from across town as the very ruin he had sold her for $30 careless became, under her steady hand, the most trusted institution in the county, and if there was any justice sharper than that quiet, visible truth standing tall again against the prairie sky, Selah never sought it and never needed to. It is worth remembering now how this story began, with a girl of 19 standing in a black wool coat amid the wreckage of her own family's ruin, with $18 to her name and not one soul left who claimed her, spending 30 of those hard-won dollars on a condemned ruin that the whole town had long since agreed was worthless. What Selah Hartwell understood, climbing alone into those dark, dust-choked rafters with her father's old conviction still steady in her chest, was something the whole of Cedar Hollow would eventually come to understand alongside her, that the truest reckonings are so rarely found where the world expects to look for them, and so often hidden, patient, and undisturbed in exactly the places everyone else has agreed to stop searching. She did not become trusted because she went looking for hidden coin. She became trusted because she had spent her whole life practicing the same quiet, unglamorous discipline her father had given her, to read a scale honestly, to look twice at what others had already written off, to believe that a bushel and a person and even an old condemned grain elevator were each owed an honest accounting before the world decided what they were worth. And when the moment finally came that called for more than careful hands and a patient eye, when it called for courage in a crowded courtroom and mercy toward the very institution that had ruined her, she answered that calling too, in the same steady voice her father had once used to explain why honesty at the scale mattered more than anything else a harvest could bring, the voice that had once bid $30 for a ruin, and now, every honest season, weighed a whole county's worth of hard-won wheat without ever once tipping the beam against a single soul who trusted her with it. Thank you for spending this time with Selah's story, and with us. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who might need reminding that nothing honestly built is ever truly beyond repair, and we would love it if you left a comment telling us your thoughts. We will leave you tonight with a single question worth sitting with. What is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? Until next time, stay close.